And for further elaborations on this issue, on the line with us right now is an international law academic, Virapat Pariyawong. Welcome to the program.
Good evening ครับคุณเจรวี Good evening ครับคุณจิตาปัตย์
สวัสดีครับ
Kun Virapat, the report has said that it reserves the right to withdraw the report if it's deemed that the government is abusing the research to help the former Prime Minister. What is your view on this?
I think the report wasn't so explicit in a way that it gives a threat in a way. I think the comment came from the King Prasatipok Institute or KPI after the institute felt that the parliament, to be more precise, the Pheu Thai party and the government might use the report as the basis to move on so quickly with the amnesty and other proposed solutions to help, for instance, Kun Thaksin and the political protesters who are still facing criminal charges right now. So I think in terms of the principle, I think it's perfectly fine. I think it's perfectly reasonable for the institute to try to clarify to the public the real stance of the report. That is to have further discussions, to have further debates about the options and proposals contained in the report. Mm-hmm. And I think if you listen carefully to the research team stresses several times that the final answer that we might reach at the end of the day might not be one of those options contained in the report. It could very well be another option that the society, the Thai society as a whole, help each other to come up with this alternative. So I think we need to look at this report as a very preliminary research, not a final answer. And I think it would be wrong for the government or for the Pheu Thai party in the parliament to move on with amnesty or with other, or just to pick one of the proposed options in the report and move on with it, because that would simply undermine the main principle of the report. It is to have further discussions, further debates, so we can all help each other come up with a proposal or with a solution that fits, that satisfy the concerns of all parties. Of course, we are not going to be completely satisfied, but at least we have to bear in mind that this is a reconciliation process. It's not a winning or losing process, and it's very important for the government to understand this.
Right. So even though the report is out, the research is out, it is actually for a suggestion purpose. It's not like that the government could actually implement those suggestions, is it?
Well, if the government wants to implement it, I think that at least the government would need to ask the House or the Parliament to help them pass the law. We look at these issues before. We look at issues where in the past the Pheu Thai party, certain members discussed the possibility of having amnesty bill presented to the Parliament. We also heard another proposal by certain members of the government that there might be a royal pardon, a decree granting pardon to certain prisoners or certain convicted criminals. So I think in the end, if amnesty is what we are concerned about, the issue will be sent back to the Parliament for discussions. But I think that is a wrong approach for the Parliament and for the government right now. I think we have to bear in mind that we are moving towards the process of constitutional revision or drafting of the new constitution. And let us not forget that the main reasons that Pheu Thai party and of course certain members of the Pheu Thai-led government claims is the legitimacy of the current constitution is questionable. It comes from the coup d'etat in 2006. And if you look at the report by KPI, the King Prasatipok Institute also underlines the fact that the investigations conducted by the special committee created by the coup instigators, or what we call them in the Thai press, the Kotosor, has legitimacy problems as well for the precise same reasons that the government who proposed the revision of the Constitution. So in my opinion, we are not only looking at particular aspects of reconciliation, but we are looking at the wider picture of moving on forward for Thai people from before the coup d'etat in 2006 and the conflicts that followed, and moving on to the peaceful road of political reform. And I think it would be wise for the government and the parliament to include the reconciliation agenda as part of the constitutional drafting agenda. Now, this may sound like a strange or a little bit new idea, because people seem to talk about constitutional drafting on one hand and reconciliation on the other. But I think we have to look at the strengths and the benefits of the process where there will be constitutional drafting assembly elected by the people. There will be referendum. The final vote is given by the people. And I think it's perfectly legitimate and reasonable for these options to be debated together with the reconciliation options. And in the end, if the parliament can come up with smart ways to integrate reconciliation discussions into constitutional revision discussion, I think we can have a reconciliation version of the Constitution for us to vote in a year or two.
Right.
Well, Kun Virapat, the King Prachatipok Institute, or KPI, is highly and widely criticized about its proposed solutions for the national reconciliation. Which part do you think is the weakest part in its report?
Well, this is interesting, because it depends on which angle do you look at the report. If you are the leader opposition, Kun Apisit made his point very clear that the report simply ignores another option, that is to move on with the current status quo and try to bring justice and conviction to those who have been instigated by the special process under the coup d'etat that continues until today. I think that is a legitimate point. And I think if we look at the answer by the King Prachatipok Institute, it's also a legitimate answer, saying that that option to stick with the status quo simply is not moving outside of the conflict zone. It is simply sticking inside the conflict zone. Personally, I think that there are a couple of touchy areas that that the research team simply ignore. The first one is, how are we going to reconcile with the coup instigators, such as General Sonthi Bonyarakarin and his peers, who instigated the coup d'etat against an elected government, an elected democratic government. I think this is a big issue, because a lot of people remember, a lot of citizens, especially the red shirt movements, they are not campaigning out Thaksin in a way. They are campaigning against coup d'etat. They are campaigning against the extra-constitutional way of removing elected governments. And unless we can find certain ways to have those coup instigators feel that they have to be responsible or at least apologetic about their instigation of the coup d'etat, which is illegal, there will be this question left hanging. What really happened in 2006? Was it legitimate? Was it right for an elected government to be thrown out by the military-led coup d'etat? And what about the people who elected those governments? What do they get in return? The people who elected Kun Thaksin might not really care whether Kun Thaksin is going to be punished or not. But I think they do care that once they cast their votes, once they go to the polls, they demand that their votes be respected. And they demand that the rule of law and the system in place guarantees that. And I think by reconciling between the people who burned down World Trade Central World and bringing the people who accuse Kun Thaksin and forgiving Kun Thaksin and just to simply providing forgiveness is not enough. I think we have to find the facts, clarify who did what and what really took place. And if we're going to forgive, we at least need to establish responsibility so we know who to forgive. We cannot simply just give out a blank check of forgiveness without knowing who did something wrong.
Kun Virapat, well, what do you think about the saying that the government the opposition is working to reach a reconciliation right now, but it seems like no sides have agreed on anything. It seems like they're waging for the war of reconciliation. What do you think?
Well, I think that is quite poetic when we talk about the war on reconciliation. There will always be a war on reconciliation. When people reconcile, people have to show their stance, they have to argue, they have to debate. I think that's perfectly natural. And I think it would be unrealistic for us to imagine Thailand to reconcile without having at least a war of opinion or a war of philosophy or a war of words. I think that's perfectly reasonable as long as we can restrain from the use of force, restrain from violence. And I think the government cannot simply just say that because we cannot find people who's going to help us to reconcile, we can move on our own by presenting amnesty bill, for instance, to Parliament. I think that's perfect. That is illegitimate, and I think that's strategy-wise not so clever. I think the government now has something that it can claim that comes from a non-partisan institution such as King Prachatipak Institute. I think if the government is sincere enough with the reconciliation, it should at least find ways to work with the Parliament or to set up or to introduce the agenda to independent committees or work with the Parliament in the way suggested by King Prachatipak Institute report, that is to have more debates, more discussions. And as I've said earlier, we are looking at reconciliation process at the same time that we are having a constitutional revision going on.
Right.
The two processes can be worked together and integrated into one. I think this is a very sensitive issue. I think that constitution that we put to the polls for people to go to referendum, I think it is legitimate and reasonable for people to also have the right to choose which option of reconciliation is the way to go. And of course, there are different ways in detail of how we're going to organize this referendum. I proposed earlier that when we go to referendum, we don't have to just answer yes or no.
Right.
We can have yes or no for the Constitution, and we can also have another vote casted specifically for the reconciliation options. I think these options need to be considered carefully. And I think by having the Constitutional Drafting Assembly elected by the people, by having a wide time frame, 240 days I've heard, or even longer, a year or so, to discuss various issues of the Constitution, including reconciliation, I think that is one solution, at least in the short term, for us to move on forward together.
All right.
Well, thank you so much, Ajahn Virapat.
Thank you, Kap. Pleasure always. Thank you, Kap.